My name is Krista Sullivan, and I'm a member of Students for a Democratic Society. We're hosting the event. If you want to come to our meetings, if you think we're for people, or you want to learn about other ideologies and social political activism, we're the group for you. We meet at 7 p.m. on Thursdays in McLean 210. Complete open membership, open to all different ideologies, multi-tendency, all-inclusive organization. Tonight we are going to be discussing socialism and socialism after Sanders. So what that means is we're going to open up with Garen tonight, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about Bernie Sanders-style socialism and democratic socialism. And then we're going to move on to Will, who's going to talk about Marxism and problems of capitalism. Makar is going to be talking to us about what socialism looks like, and then Tom is going to be talking about strategies for revolution. If you have any questions, we're going to have a discussion for the whole group at the end. So please hold them until then. Unless it's really urgent, then throw your hand up. Awesome. We hope to see you at our meetings, and stick around afterwards to talk.
Okay, so what I'll be talking about is a few 9 key points that Sanders really brought up throughout his entire campaign. The first being that the limit of corporate interest spending in campaigns by proposing an amendment that would not let corporate or private businesses be able to give unlimited amount to campaigns, and if it's over or nearly $10,000 to the campaign, the group must give some form of disclosure. So this pretty much puts a stop from major corporations, major groups, giving unlimited amount of money to campaigns for whatever reason. And it makes it to where if it's nearly $10,000, then they have to give who the group was and why exactly they did that. Second point that's brought up is, as we all, if you are a fan of Sanders, you already know, but free universal preschool and free tuition for public colleges and universities by taxing the wealthier more and taxing some of Wall Street transactions. Now this plan would have cost $70 billion a year, but don't let the number necessarily scare you. I'll bring up in a little bit the increase of income tax on the wealthier, and it's able to completely pay for everything, as well as when you start to tax certain Wall Street transactions, this allows to actually pay for this plan, and it's actually able to function. A third point that's brought up is the breakup of the big banks by taking the large banks and turning them into smaller entities and charging a new fee for high-risk investment practices, and also push for the federal bank to loan more money to small businesses. So we all know, if you've ever listened to Sanders speak, you know how he feels about Wall Street and the big banks. So one of the big points he brings up, especially in the idea of democratic socialism, is to break up your bigger banks and make them smaller to where they don't hold as much power over the system as a whole, or the country as a whole. Plus, furthermore, kind of push these bigger banks that will end up as small entities to give more money to these smaller businesses, so they have more of a chance to thrive in our country, rather than have all this money and all this power towards bigger corporations. Fourthly, launch a universal healthcare system provided by the government. Now, though Sanders did vote in favor of the Affordable Care Act, and he has said that he supports Obamacare fully, he does believe that it isn't hitting the target completely, and proposes a Medicaid for all system that is a single-payer system in which the federal and state governments would provide. And it would cost nearly $3.8 trillion over 10 years that would be paid for by individuals and employers and by a new progressive income tax. So we're all aware of the whole idea of affordable health care, and Sanders kind of wants to take it farther than Obama did, because though Obamacare has helped millions of people, it really hasn't hit the target, and there are still millions that are uninsured, and he really wants to capture that and fix that problem, especially through democratic socialism. Furthermore, like I mentioned before on how this is all really paid, the fifth point is all about the income tax. The income tax would be raised for those making over $250,000 a year. The rates would rise nearly to 37%, and those making nearly $10 million a year would be paying nearly 57% in income taxes. Other fees and taxes would be increased, such as Social Security taxes for the higher income. So what you'd see is your middle class and the poor classes aren't necessarily getting their taxes raised at all. So this isn't really affecting them, this is actually helping them, because what you're seeing is an increase of taxes towards the more rich, the ones who can actually afford it, or the ones who aren't even paying their taxes in the first place, which is a little messed up. Now, my sixth point is about global warming. Global warming is a problem that needs attention. Sanders brings that up, and anyone who has a bit of common sense knows that global warming is a problem and it does exist. So Sanders has proposed a bill that would charge companies for carbon emissions and use those funds from it to help boost renewable energy and push to move forward with more greener form of technology. So a lot of what's brought up, especially in his ideals and plans, is to make sure that we can reduce the amount of emissions that we're pouring into the ecosystem, and by doing that we can charge these companies a certain percentage so they can slow down the amount of emissions that they're emitting, as well as move that money that we're getting from it to fund more green renewable energy and make newer technologies that will benefit us all, including our planet. 7, Sanders also calls for a ban of assault rifles, also believes that the states, not the federal government, should handle waiting periods for handguns, and also an expansion on federal background checks on guns in general. 8thly, Sanders supports a pathway to citizenship. He even voted on an immigration bill in 2013 that would have increased border security and make it easier for over 10 million people to gain citizenship. And very much like Obama, he also waved against the deportation of certain groups of immigrants, especially the ones that came over here as children. If you came over here as a child through the immigration system illegally, you wouldn't be able to stay, you wouldn't be deported. He really supported that idea. Furthermore, the 9th point, lastly, is that Sanders also believes in ending all foreign wars going on and called the withdrawal of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's very obviously pro-peace and wants to end the war. So this means that in Sanders' style and democratic socialism, we would get out of the unnecessary wars that we've put ourselves into, especially in Iraq, where we're currently going back to, and Afghanistan, where we've kind of been stuck. In the words of Bernie Sanders, democratic socialism means that we must create an economy that works for all, not just the very wealthy. Democratic socialism means that we must reform a political system in America today, which is not only grossly unfair, but in many respects corrupt. So Bernie's path to a political revolution has been the only path to have nearly as much support as it did. Millions of people came out and supported him. Hundreds of thousands of people showed up to his rallies, and tons of people each month would donate nearly millions of dollars. He didn't use a super PAC, he used the people to fund him the way that it actually should be done. And it showed that the people did care about him and cared for his message and the idea of democratic socialism, especially with the small donations of $27. His path to change in this country is and will be the only reasonable path to turn this country around and embrace the ideas of democratic socialism. Because on the side of the left-wing spectrum, further than what the Democrats stand for, if you really want to call them left-wing, his ideas and his path and what he said got the most attention out of anyone has gotten in decades. So what we need to realize is the path that Bernie comes with and what he produces is what needs to be followed and the only reasonable path that we have. Thank you.
So that's one kind of socialism, and that kind, democratic socialism, what it does is it tries to use the government to patch the problems of capitalism. So it's a democratic socialist, they see poverty, they see inequality and war, and the way to address those problems is to generally use the government as an agent of the people to try to fix them. The difference between that kind of socialism and radical socialism, which is what the rest of us are going to be talking about, is that we see these problems as inherent within the capitalist system. So we say that you cannot get rid of poverty, inequality, immigration problems, and so on without transitioning to a different kind of society. So the part that I'm going to talk about is Marxism and Marx's contribution to political economy. Because this Marx's critique of capitalism, which is what he mostly devoted his life to, is what radical socialists have based their ideas on in their paths for a solution. So, what is capitalism? Hard question. Very, very complicated economic system. Marx studied capitalism all of his life, and he did something that very few people have ever done, and that's that he read every single person before him that wrote on political economy, and he critiqued it, and he has like a 1,500-page book called Theories of Surplus Value, where he goes through and annotates it all. And he found something new that he thought that everybody else before him had missed. So I'll take you through that analysis briefly right now. So we noticed that there's two different kinds of exchanges. The first kind is to have, to start with a commodity. It can be any kind of commodity, a t-shirt, a software program, it doesn't matter. And you trade that commodity for money, and then you use that money to buy another commodity. So this kind of transaction starts with a commodity and it ends with a commodity. Marx also identified a second kind of transaction that starts with money, and you use money to buy another commodity, and then you sell that commodity to end with more money. And he found that some people in capitalism have been able to end up with more money than they started with. They start with $100, they buy some variation of collection of commodities, and then they end with $110 or $120. And so Marx set about trying to figure out what the source of that profit was, that extra, which he would call surplus. So most commodities, or there have been various explanations of where this profit comes from. There's many that were in use then that are still in use today. But Marx saw that if you look at all the commodities on the market, you can assume that they all trade at their values. So a t-shirt, you can buy a t-shirt for $10, and chances are you're only going to be able to sell it for $10 or $9 or maybe even less. If you buy a car for $5,000, you're probably going to have to sell it for $5,000 or less. And he went through and he found that there was one commodity on the market that you could buy that would give you more value in return. And he found that to be labor power. And the reasoning for this is because human beings can produce more stuff when they're working than it takes to keep them alive. So if you only require, say, $70 worth of food, shelter, clothing, and all that, you might be able to produce $80 or $100 or $150 worth of stuff when you're producing things. So the difference between the amount of money that it takes to keep the worker alive and the amount of stuff that they produce, Marx called the surplus, which he found to be the source of profit. And he goes through history, and he has multiple works on different historical societies, and he found there's about 5 ways to organize this, what he calls the distribution and appropriation of surplus. And he says that the way that a society does that affects their politics, it affects their culture, it affects their language, and it greatly influences most parts of that society. If the surplus is appropriated, if the surplus is given to somebody else who is not the worker, Marx called that exploitation. And whenever Marx discusses exploitation in that terms, he's not talking about working conditions, he's not talking about transnational distributions of wealth, he's talking specifically about a worker putting in work and then getting less in return. But the other kinds of exploitation are important, of course. So capitalism, which is similar to slavery and feudalism in this respect, is one of these exploitative class structures. So the story in capitalism is that you have employees and employers. You have the working class and the capitalist class. And the working class agrees to come to work, say 8 hours a day, Monday through Friday. They'll get paid, a specific wage, maybe $10 an hour. And at the end of the day, all the stuff that they produce, whether that be t-shirts or software programs or even services, immediately becomes the property of the capitalist. So the capitalist then takes those commodities that have extra value in them and sells them on the market and keeps the extra, keeps the profit for him or herself. Marx also showed how within capitalism there's an intense system of competition, meaning that capitalists basically cannot be nice to their workers if they want to. There's constantly competition between each different firm. They have to raise their profit rates, otherwise they will go behind and fall out of business, which creates all sorts of tensions, which he referred to as class conflict. And that manifests itself in many different ways. So the problems that he identified with capitalism, oh sorry, real quick, I have another picture. Here's a working day. This is a sample working day. For the first 5 hours of this 8-hour working day, you would be doing work for yourself that you would get in the form of a wage at the end of the day. The last part, you would be doing extra surplus work that immediately becomes the property of the capitalist, which is the nature of all these problems. So there's multiple problems with capitalism. I'm sure many of you are aware of them. In the Marxian explanation, the first problem is exploitation. So the fact that workers are getting ripped off. He says that's kind of a problem. A second problem is that one person or a small number of people gets to decide how to spend all that surplus. And in total, society has a lot of surplus. We create a lot of profits, and how that money is spent is decided upon by a very small group of people. Modern-day CEOs and boards of directors are the capitalists of today. Furthermore, capitalism has periodic crises, and the rate of profit that capitalists get over time decreases, which makes the system unstable, and it causes crises, which, unemployment and all sorts of problems. Furthermore, people become alienated because they have no say in basically what production decisions are made. so they feel detached from society on multiple levels. The government gets bought out by capitalists, so the kinds of reforms that Garen is talking about become very difficult because the people with the money who pay for the campaigns and stuff are basically, in the pockets of capitalists. There's also war, tensions, and so on. Huge list of problems. So Marxian communism, which is what Makar is about to discuss, the simple definition would be a society where the same group of people who produces that extra, that surplus, is also the same group of people who decides how it's spent. It's not dependent upon state ownership, it's not dependent upon the abolition of markets, it's not dependent upon the abolition of private property or equal wages or any of that, although those kinds of things can exist in a communist society, and some of them are very desirable. But that's basically the gist of Marx's contribution.
Okay, so I think the best way to explain what a socialist society looks like is to explain what it isn't. Socialism is definitely not state capitalism. It's not authoritarianism. It's not totalitarianism. It's not Big Brother, and it's not big government. Socialism is in fact a democratization of the economy, of the means of production, and the distribution of products and wealth. What you might associate socialism with is what most commonly is considered to be state capitalism. In state capitalism, the government takes place of the capitalists running the economy. Instead of privately owned factories, for example, the government becomes the player and the agent that runs the factories. And so in doing so, it becomes the capitalist itself. That is why it's called state capitalism. And the profit of the factory and the products that are made are given back to the government, and the government decides what to do with the profit and the products. And this is essentially what most people believe socialism to be. They believe it to be big government. Anything the government does, and the more government involvement there is, that is socialism. However, that isn't necessarily what socialism is, as Will already described. Socialism is actually the workers controlling the means of production, what's being made, how it's being made, when it's being made, what happens to the products, what happens to the profits. And this has to be done through a democratic process and through an association of workers. That is the key difference between what most people consider socialism to be and what it really is on paper. Socialism is a very revolutionary change in how the economy and production and distribution of wealth is handled. As you can probably imagine, state capitalism and socialism by nature correlate with different political and social systems, where state capitalism is a tendency to drift towards strong government because the government controls everything in production and the economy itself. Socialism has to be a democracy by nature because the workers control everything that happens at a democratic level. So what would a socialist society look like? You've probably heard this term before, planned economy. The connotation of this word is almost always negative and associated with state-controlled trade, agricultural collectivization, and long lines at the grocery store. As we just discussed, most of that association comes from empirical evidence of state capitalist societies. However, that is not necessarily what socialist planned economies look like. In a socialist planned economy, you would likely see an expropriation of the major aspects of the economy, such as banks, infrastructure, and land, as well as a lot of other economic commodities. The essence of this is that the working class controls what happens with everything that is being made. So that being said, it puts that the goal of socialist economies is very far from where we are now, simply because stabilizing a democratically elected working association would be really difficult to do from where we stand because of the nature of capitalism and the amount of control that the upper tier has on our society. We're probably more likely to go through the state capitalism route. And while I've described this in a somewhat negative light, state capitalism does have a lot of benefits and is a good first step towards socialism. And you might be thinking that state capitalism involves a lot of the negative things that you know about historical state capitalist societies, such as the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, and unfortunately North Korea as well. However, there are a lot of positive examples that can be given to support state capitalism in many different areas. For example, when Russia switched to state capitalism, it increased its industrial production 52 times in 50 years, which is significantly more than any contending superpower ever did. Productivity went up about 1,310% in that same time period. Life expectancy doubled. Child mortality fell by 9 times, and the country had more doctors per 100,000 people than any other country in the world. And this was all thanks to the planned economy. Essentially, a lot of empirical evidence proves that planned economy, even through state capitalism, is an excellent way to steer society towards a more equal situation. One of the things that's very important in society in general is wages. One common misconception of a socialist society is that everyone has equal pay and therefore no one has incentive to take on harder jobs that require more education or training. The answer to this kind of dilemma is quite simple. Income does not have to be equal in a socialist society. Though it's true that in socialist communities, there isn't nearly as wide of a range between the highest level professions and the lowest level professions, a lot of income is still going to vary depending on the profession that you have. This is derived from a very famous quote that has been applied in a lot of state capitalist countries, known as to each according to his contribution. Essentially, this means that you're going to be paid what you contribute to society. And this eliminates the one interesting part of a capitalist society in that private owners who receive income from interest, rent, profit, and stocks no longer have the ability to have wages through work that isn't really theirs, like Will had already mentioned. And in doing so, you create a society where there's a lot more economic and political stability and equality among the people who are contributing to production and the economy as a whole. And building off of that, another key criticism of wages and working in a socialist society is incentivization of labor. Why do people want to work if they're not paid really, really well for what they do? However, that criticism in of itself is flawed because it's looking at socialism through a capitalist lens. And in a capitalist society, you're working for profit. And that in many ways pressures you to work in a specific way and oftentimes in an inefficient way to produce the desirable outcome. Whereas in a socialist society, the idea is that you are creating an environment in which the efficiency of labor is democratically controlled to the point that you don't have to worry about working for a profit, and you're in fact working for yourself and for the community because of collective ownership. Because everyone owns the means of production and the products themselves, you are essentially working for yourself when you come to work in a socialist society. Now that also means that we will see a lot of changes in all sorts of areas in society, from science to education to medical care. Because we're not going to be dependent on profit-based organizations and profit-based infrastructure, we're going to be able to produce a lot more scientific breakthroughs simply because scientists won't be pressured into working for profit and creating so-called research and reports that in fact only work to proliferate more profit. And the same goes for the medical system, in which companies essentially work to create more profit instead of actually providing medical service to people. What we're going to see instead is the removal of profit from the very center of our society, and instead we will see a strong change in the way people behave towards work and towards people in their community.
All right, but now that Makara has described what a socialist society is, how it would look like, how do we get there? There are two basic means through which Marxists wish to overthrow the capitalist system. There's gradualism, which favors a generally more non-violent democratic approach. And there is revolution, which, not surprisingly, involves a violent overthrow of government. Gradualism is one of the later theories of change, and it developed out of the 20th century and the late 19th century after Marx's death. There's one person named Edward Bernstein, and he started the gradualist movement with including that in the revisionist platform. It's sort of what allowed it to grow. Although revisionism now is essentially frowned upon as a reformulation of Marxian ideals. No longer orthodox Marxism, and most people don't really see it as Marxism anymore. There's also revolutionary Marxism, which is more orthodox, it's more true to what Marx believed. And you can see that in the revolutions of 1848, when essentially the workers and various industrial classes attempted to rise up against the governments which oppressed them, in which they had no say. So gradualism, you see gradualism everywhere. It's part of social democracy. It generally attempts to work through the systems that are already in place instead of attempting to establish new ones, although it does sometimes attempt to establish new ones in order to actually bring forward change. The philosophy of gradualism is that countries ruled by capitalist societies are generally more willing to change instead of those which do not have capitalist societies. So gradualism you see a lot more in the first world, where you don't have authoritarian governments that don't provide tools for change. You see gradualism more here, more so in Europe, and throughout the world in democracies. Gradualist philosophy essentially holds that people will inevitably change, society will inevitably change, and the path to get there is non-violent. Violence in many democratic societies would only prolong the state of domination because a lot of capitalist societies have larger militaries, more resources, and any period of violent revolution would definitely leave them devastated. Revolutionary thought, especially so in other countries, essentially focuses upon the lack of ability to change. Revolutionary thought believes that there is no means of change through which the bourgeois can be overthrown because the bourgeois control the society totally. In the manifesto, Marx essentially advocated violent revolution because he didn't see as much democratic tendencies within his society and within the societies of Europe at the time. So as people gained rights, as people gained the ability to have their say in government, non-violent means could be used more and more. So you have the right in this country to speak what you believe. You have the right to assemble on that belief. And you have the right to petition the government for redress. In many societies during Marx's time, you didn't have those rights. If you advocated against the government, you could be arrested and thrown in prison. And you had no real tools for change. So, Marxist philosophy is driven by the exploitation of the proletariat, which is the lower class, and by the bourgeois of the upper class. If there are no means to overthrow the bourgeois, then revolutionary theory will dominate. If there are means through which to change the society, then gradualism could dominate. And that's essentially the two different theories of change.
Cool. So for the last half, we're going to open it up for questions and comments. If you would like to make a point, feel free to, or talk for more than just a one-sentence question. We were thinking maybe 3-minute limits, but if you got something to say, please feel free to say it. So yeah, who wants to go first? Anything we missed? Yes, Ben.
Hey, so there seems to be a pretty definitive cleavage in the presentation of the socialisms up here, the radical socialism, Tom McCarr and Will, and then Garen's excellent defense of Bernie Sanders' democratic socialism. I think that Garen articulated more policy proposals, probably because that was an essential part of Bernie Sanders' campaign. But I think a lot of the questions that we might have as an audience would be, in terms of radical socialism, what are some policy proposals in the now or adjacent future that could be used to establish this kind of socialism?
Do you mean like in the U.S. or in
Yeah, in the US or in an advanced capitalist country, or take it how you will.
I think one big example would be any kind of policy, even at a private level, that allows for more worker input into whatever is being done in the company or institution, whatever it may be. And I know that a lot of private companies have been doing that, and certain governments, like the Venezuelan government, the Cuban government, have moved towards associations of workers in which companies are driven more by what the workers believe is best for production and working time and wages and such. And they found, for the most part, and I don't have any statistics on hand, so you can take the word for it, but they found for the most part that there is an increase in efficiency overall when there's a more democratic input among the people who work in the institution or establishment than simply through CEO involvement or a board committee, whatever runs the institution. So that would be one policy change, is more input from the workers themselves, people who run the meat production, not the production, but are the meat production.
To add to that, I think that a lot of the policies that Bernie Sanders proposed and that Garen talked about would be generally agreeable for most radical socialists. I think we would pretty much agree that the minimum wage should probably be raised from like whatever $7.65 in Missouri to like $15 or something like that. However, the Black Panther Party was really good about this. They said that those kinds of reforms should be pursued to the end that they have a long-term vision of creating some kind of like, communist society where we do control the means of production. So those things are generally agreeable, especially things, like relating to like inequality and stuff like that. They also, some radical socialists also promote the use of government resources to be directed at workers' cooperatives, which is kind of what McCarr was talking about. So if we were to divert government resources to funding workers' cooperatives, which are private enterprises where the workers democratically make all the decisions, Italy has a law called the Marcora Law that they created in the 1980s that allow you to basically be fronted 3 years of unemployment benefits if you get together with a group of 90 of your buddies. So they have these workers' cooperatives of 10 people or more in Italy that are financed by the government. And then after a certain period of time, the business becomes autonomous and they're able to, become private communist, class structures. Those are also generally kind of the direction that radical socialists go for. Anything else? Was there anything you had in mind then?
No, I was just asking what your vision of that would be.
I have a question. There's some people who argue that socialism can only happen on a global level, that you can't build socialism in your backyard, and that if you try to build it in your backyard, it'll inevitably fail. And so then my question is if, and then the corollary of that is that socialism isn't going to happen like on a global level for hundreds of years, and so we're like in this transitionary period. And so then my question is two questions, I guess. One, do you believe that? Do you agree with that? And two, if that's true, is Bernie Sanders' type of democratic socialism in this stage the best that realistically we can hope for? And so we have these ideals that we would like to see, but none of us are going to live long enough to see them implemented.
Okay, so on the side of that, Bernie Sanders' plan is the more realistic plan, and the more realistic idea of democratic socialism has been done. Specifically, like he brings up a lot, is Norway. It is a really good example of democratic socialism. Yeah, it's very hard to do socialism in general on a global scale. I believe that if you can get the major powers to change from their capitalistic systems to more of a democratic socialist appeal, and then maybe even go to the side of what they have talked about, that's possible. But when you have major powers like the United States, who is very, very capitalist, they're easily able to smash any other country down who wants to be more socialistic or communist. We've seen that in the past. In the 20th century, every time there was a country who became communist or became more socialistic, they would cut off ties with countries like the United States, and really any allies that were friends with the United States pretty much did the same. You saw that especially with Vietnam. When Vietnam decided to become communist, the U.S. got involved, got in war. In the case of Cuba, the United States cut ties with Cuba, and so did a lot of nations follow with them. So if you can really change the superpowers in charge and make them more of the socialist approach or more democratic socialist, like Bernie Sanders brings up, then I think really you can achieve that goal of global socialism. But it really lies at those major superpowers.
Yeah, I agree with Garen. I think most of the examples that people give of a failed socialist system don't really account for the contextual circumstances the countries were going through when they were transitioning into a socialist society. For example, China, Russia went through multiple decade-long conflicts, violent conflicts, and of course intervention from capitalist societies. Like the Russian Revolution was put under intervention by 4 countries that invaded Russia shortly after Bolsheviks took power. So a lot of the circumstances for socialist countries in the past have been stomped on to some extent by multiple occurrences of violence and not just intervention, but simply the situation that they had at the time. So one of the things is that a lot of countries that at this point are economically and politically stable enough to attempt socialism haven't really done so. And the most success we could point to at this point is the Scandinavian socialism that we see today, which is what's been brought up already. And that's just a small example of what an economy and political system is capable of if it's in the right position to make the transition gradually and thoroughly, instead of the more chaotic atmosphere that a lot of past countries have experienced.
I think there's also, to not totally lose hope, I think there's something to be said about remembering that capitalism is not like an eternal system. It's only been around in the world for like 300 or 400 years, depending on how you look at history. And that if you look at like Marx had an interesting point, if you look at the transition between feudalism and capitalism, it was a very long, drawn-out, conflict. It basically occurred everywhere around the world. There was places where the transition was violent. There was places where the transition was not violent. And the working out of the specific class struggles within these kinds of systems is really dependent upon a bunch of other factors. I think I don't think there's one eternal theory that the revolution must be violent or it must be peaceful. Realistically, if we are to go in the direction of a communist society in the world, it'll probably be slow, it'll be painful, it'll happen unevenly, it'll happen in different forms throughout the world. I personally am of the opinion that the central countries, the more rich ones, where capitalism developed first and the most, hold a lot more power, especially because of the military. And if they're not the ones that do it first, then, they essentially have to be on board before the Latin American countries. Cuba, like what Makar was talking about, is actually transitioning to a communist society where the workers control things. And just now we recently lifted the embargo. So I think that'll be an interesting experiment to look at to see how capitalism might permeate that society and maybe thwart things. But it's really historically specific.
Okay, so when talking about socialism with people who don't necessarily agree with it, I always hear the combat the U.S. is too large for socialism to be successful and effective. How would you guys, or anybody in the room, if they want to discuss this, how would you combat that?
Okay. I think that's not a very fair assessment, considering now, of course, these countries are no longer socialist, but the implementation of socialism in both Russia and China had very similar circumstances in terms of sheer size, by landmass, population, political and economic power at the time. The one difference, again, being that they weren't nearly as stable as the U.S. is now, and arguably had a much weaker political system in which they could implement the changes that were necessary. So in the United States especially, it would be more than feasible, and the size itself wouldn't really affect the changes whatsoever. In fact, in many situations, it would actually be really beneficial to have a larger country implement socialist policies because there's more resources and more technology and more economic power available for the country to actually go through with the transition. I don't think that size for the United States was really a big obstacle.
Capitalism started out pretty small too. Like the original capitalist enterprises were 3, 4, 10 people. And they had to figure out how to get big too. We're going to hire managers, we're going to put everyone in a factory. And actually existing communist class structures are currently figuring out answers to the questions that they face too.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about Norway before we get too far away from that. So, just so how it happens, my high school had 3 Norwegian foreign exchange students every year, and we would send 3 of ours to live there for a month. And one part about Norway is that they have a universal healthcare organization, which is nice because it affords everyone that healthcare. But one thing I heard from every Norwegian that either my friends talked to or I've talked to is a complaint about the quality of the healthcare. All of them describe hour-long waits, medical staff that weren't really invested in their care or their treatment, and a lack of access to medication that would have helped lots of people. So while it's wonderful that everyone in Norway has access to universal healthcare, what policies would you propose that the healthcare is of a higher quality?
Really, Norway being the smaller nation that it is, it's very much different than the United States. Being the United States, if we had the push towards universal healthcare, I definitely think as many bright minds as we have within our country, of the 318 or so million people within the country, I think it wouldn't be hard to move to better technology, get rid of those long waits, because we easily have a massive amount of hospitals available and doctors available. Plus, if you move into the whole free tuition, you can get more people readily available to actually be able to pursue their dreams of the medical field and actually be able to help the people that they're wanting to help. Plus, you can even further afford more hospitals and stuff on the lines of that if you stop the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that cost us so much. I mean, the federal government spends 56% of its entire budget on the military. Imagine if you cut that nearly in half, where that money could go. So I think that problem can definitely be fixed. I don't necessarily know the exact policies that we put in place, but that's an issue that I think can be easily resolved within the United States. So go off there, or?
If we were making economic decisions democratically and we saw that the healthcare industry needed more resources to cut down on lines, I think we could very easily within a communist class structure decide consciously, all right, we need more doctors. These lines are ridiculous. We need this kind of healthcare. We need more doctors that can help deliver babies or treat cancer or whatever. So those kinds of things will have to be worked out, but I think it's very possible.
I think pretty sure McCarr has brought this up in our own discussions, especially the great thing about socialism, whether it be democratic socialism, communism, whatever, the government really tries to help you achieve the dreams that you want. So you would get more of those doctors that people who actually want to get into the medical field, that's more of an option, because these forms of government do everything they can to push you to your career goals. And I think, McCarr, you kind of talked about that before. Or?
Well, I mean, it's kind of what Will said about the fact that in a socialist society, in an actual socialist society, and not really like state capitalism or just kind of mirror image of socialism, you would have a democratic force that would be able to respond very thoroughly and fairly quickly to any possible negative aspects of the specific sector. So if there really were issues, universal healthcare or whatnot, it would be fairly feasible to. I mean, it obviously wouldn't be easy, and it would take probably years and years of actual work and political change and economic change, but it would certainly be doable within the structure of a socialist society.
Could I say one thing about that as well? From my perspective, part of it has to do with equal access to healthcare as well. And this has long been a complaint that people lay out, so if you go like Canada, you have to wait so long for this, and in the United States, you can get it right away. And in my experience, yeah, it's great if you have the resources to purchase the commodity of healthcare right away. And this has changed a little bit with the Affordable Care Act. But if you don't have the resources to buy that health care, rather than waiting an hour, you wait an entire lifetime until you die, and you never have access to the health care that you need. And so I think at least in these transitionary stages, that is maybe a compromise that you're making, is that you're having the wait times as a trade-off for universal access. And that's a question of what do we value as a society, that everybody has equal access, or some people have more access than others.
Just so that there's hope in Senator Sanders' policy proposals on the legislative level, do you know of anyone on the national legislative stage that can be seen as someone with a figure either of the democratic socialism or something similar to that?
That are very much like Bernie, or like that are fighting for the same thing. For a while, it seemed like Senator Elizabeth Warren was fighting for it. I can't really tell now, especially when she kind of started being a suck up to Clinton in lamest terms. But she definitely still fights on the side of the policies of making these bigger banks smaller, breaking them up, and fighting against Wall Street, which was a big issue and a big point that Sanders did bring up. So, though Warren has kind of become a suck-up, she still is fighting for major issues, and I would align her on the side with Bernie. But I think one of the great things about Bernie and his movement was the fact that it's inspired a lot of people. There are a lot of people currently, I can't give you necessarily examples right now, but there are a lot of people who are running for elections that are kind of going off the same token as Bernie did, kind of off his own platform. And with this kind of movement that Bernie has created, it's going to continue within the next few years, especially with his project now, the Our Revolution, will inspire more people to run for office that have the same ideals. So we'll definitely not only be able to get people with the same ideals as Bernie on the national level, but even on the state level, the state legislators.
I can't remember the exact name of it right now, but there's like this huge list, and it's like a part of a bigger campaign where they like track politicians, like local, state, and national level politicians that are similar to the ideologies of Bernie Sanders. It was like 500 something. Does anybody know? Anyway, it's just a huge like list. It tells you like, who's more similar, and if they're like in your district or like in your state. And I'm gonna try and find that in the next 10 minutes. Unless anybody in here knows about that. Do you know about it, Karen?
I feel like I know what you're talking about, but I can't really. It's like right there, but I don't know necessarily.
On the Seattle has an 8-person city council, and there's I forget how many people in that city, but a fair amount of people in Seattle. And one of the people who just got elected a couple years ago is Kashima Sawa, who is a member of Socialist Alternative, which sometimes can be considered a radical socialist organization. And she has a fair amount of power there, but one person out of 8.
So, if you're keeping up with like Bernie Sanders and his campaign this last year, there were many instances in which you could say that the establishment, and more specifically the Democratic Party, like shut him out and pushed him to the side. So with seeing how our institution, our political institution, dealt with that, do you guys think that there is any opportunity to see a president or a major party leader to be socialist or to support Bernie Sanders' views in the recent future?
One would argue that it's more likely based on a gradualist point of view.
because it raised a lot of awareness about socialist topics and how social democracy could function in a society like ours. But it depends on, a lot of the time, what you believe in. Like, a revolutionary socialist would say, the evidence of manipulation against Bernie Sanders is evidence that the system is controlled by a corrupt group of individuals who are only interested in maintaining their own power. And it's a struggle between the actual opinions of the people versus the people who wish to maintain the power of their party or themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is very difficult for movements like Bernie Sanders to actually make it to the point where they hold any real political power simply because of the DNC and general establishment, as you say, shutting down any efforts to do that. But I think kind of what Tom said of the awareness that's been raised by the Sanders movement opened up the discussion of socialism for the first time in America for a very long time. And it's been really taboo and pretty frequently and systematically shut down by any intellectual and political official as it's bad, we can't talk about it, it's not the right way to organize politically or economically. And Bernie's done for the first time what no one has done in a long time is put socialism back at a very national level. And even just in the polls, even if he didn't have the same percentages as Trump or Hillary, he had a very unprecedented number of followers who strongly supported a lot of his ideas. So I think it does show that in the future, hopefully the near future, the Sanders movement in one way or another will come back with stronger forces.
If I could add one thing to that. We're living, I think, right now, and it's kind of hard for us to see it, like 20-year-olds. We're living in a very exceptional period of history. The recession in 2007 and 2008, which is pretty much still ongoing for most people, was basically the worst economic collapse we've had since the Great Depression. Wages in this country, if you look at the median and statistics like that, have basically not really gone up since the 70s. We've been taking on huge amounts of debt. People are working more hours. And I think that if you look around and see what's happening in this society, the arrows are pointing to increased tension and people are getting really dissatisfied. I think that the people who support Donald Trump are in similar situations to what we're complaining about up here, except instead of going, the socialist communist route, they went, the fascist route, and are supporting Trump. And, he's able to get up there and he's able to lie on national television in, debates, and people will still support him. It's not necessarily because they're stupid. It's because they're desperate. And people in this country right now are getting increasingly desperate, and we have it pretty good compared to most of the world. If you go to other countries in the periphery, the situation is worse, and other nations have had very strong socialist and communist party movements appear. So I think that in our lifetimes, we're going to probably start seeing some of the consciousness change in the world.
So earlier you guys said that it was both Russia and China that created not a capitalist society, a socialist communist society out of a time of struggle. And do you think that that's the only key maybe in the state of the U.S. since we are kind of, I feel like there's a lot of, what you're saying, there's a lot of distress on both ends of the spectrum. Do you think, what's that theory that you told me about once? Acceleration theory?
Yeah, that theory says you should vote for Trump to speed up the revolution, but probably not a great idea.
But do you think that's what it comes down to? Just getting to a point of desperation where we need a different fix and we finally exhausted all of our options within the status quo?
I mean, if you're hungry, you're more willing to fight. I mean, it definitely brings this issue to the forefront of people's consciousness. I mean, it helps, paradoxically.
So our group is here from an intercultural communications class. So we're kind of here as an unbiased perspective. We want to get to know a little bit more just about different kinds of theories that we're really interested in. So concerning this political ideology, would you say that there's a certain lifestyle that's involved, or is there a counterculture kind of a movement that's going on? We just want to know a little bit more just objectively about what you would have to say about that.
I wish there was.
I mean, there kind of is in a way. It really has to be a different culture if you're basing the entirety of society on a totally different concept, right? Like, if you're talking about a socialist society where everything is actually, well, ideally democratic, obviously it'll take a while for us to ever get there. But if things are really done in a way where people earn what equal to what they contribute to society, and the rest of their time is spent on doing what they have interest in doing, it's probably going to be a very different kind of cultural environment. There's definitely less room for a lot of racial and class problems because people are put on a different level, and there isn't like the same kind of competition that you would see in a capitalist society necessarily, where everyone inherently has to be looking out for themselves before anyone else. And just from personal experience, my dad's side of the family grew up in the Soviet Union, and of course, like I said, that wasn't really a socialist society, but there were very, very different cultural aspects to everyday life, and people treated each other in a very different manner because there wasn't really a necessity for profit and competition. And it's not an ideal example, but it's probably a close image to what socialism eventually could look like on a cultural level.
Another reason why you would have to probably change the culture is a lot of our culture is based upon materialism, commercialization, and capitalism itself. A lot of our programming, our television, our media, is governed by profit. So in order to change the values of the society away from profit, you would have to stop reinforcing that through the media and therefore change the culture.
And like within the culture of resistance itself, you know, like communists and socialists, they have their own musicians, you know, they have their own kinds of art that they really like. They tend to associate with each other. Like, I don't know, I'm friends with a bunch of people in here who are communists. And, you know, we're friends outside of that. But, you know, that common ideology, I think, really allows for, like, a special kind of bond to form. But, you know, there's definitely a counterculture that's developing in this country. Black Lives Matter, I think, would be a good place to look for that. The counterculture hopefully will be significantly different than the one that we had in the 60s, but hopefully it will be similar in some ways as well. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely a counterculture that's developing. Got about 2 minutes left before we're scheduled to leave. Does anybody else have any comments or questions? We can also hang around as long as we want. I don't have nothing to do.
So say I've read bits of the Communist Manifesto, and I've done a presentation in an English class over 1984 on the manifesto. So say we're able to create a socialist or communistic society, how would we stop someone from, how would we stop the existing proletariat from completely taking over society and transferring themselves into the bourgeois and creating themselves as the new ruling class and not create this socialist? How do we stop a proletariat from just nixing socialism altogether?
Tough question. Tackle it out.
The idea of 1984 at least really stems from a very different direction towards socialism through big government and like state capitalism, as I mentioned, where the government is the actor of all production and all wealth. And that obviously is very dangerous in terms of the dictatorship of the proletariat taking over and, you know, steering society in the wrong direction. But socialism itself, once you get there, is democratic by definition because the workers control the policies that are made purely by means of democracy. So the area where you would be tripping up is the path to socialism itself. That's where the greatest difficulty is in making sure that in the transition, if you are going through something like state capitalism or any kind of gradualistic approach, you don't allow the people who consider themselves quit working for the interests of the people to start working for their own interests. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's another dimension to theories of revolution is like vanguardism or mass movement. So like vanguard, you got like a small group of professional communists, and they're going to go fix everything for the working class because the working class people have to work. But yeah, if it's a mass movement, if more people are involved, and if you do like prefigurative politics, where you start practicing what you want to see now to help give a direction to where you want to end up, then I think there will be more democratically made decisions. Real quick, I like to throw this in always. There's a company in Spain called Mondragon. It's a workers cooperative. It has about 80,000 worker owners, and they do basically just that. Collectively appropriate the surplus value. They've made their own university. They have, I think, their own roads. They have their own bank. And they do that without the authoritarianness. Because one strategy has been to seize control of the government and use the government to make reforms, but that's kind of dangerous. So yeah, it really just depends on the path you take.
I don't think this will answer your question at all, but it might be an interesting read. I think when we talk a lot about Marxism, we talk a lot about Marx as an economist, but we don't really talk about Marx as a social theorist. And Marx developed a theory called conflict theory, which just like basically says that society functions through the conflict that classes have between each other. I didn't actually think about that until like just now, because I've never even thought about that question. I thought it was an awesome question. So I'm not trying to answer you. I'm just trying to help.
Anyone's still a capitalist?
I have one question. It's a very basic question. What I want to ask is if government starts taking control of production and stuff, like if government workers have control of the production and stuff, there will be less confidence, there will be no profit incentive at all. What's the guarantee that the economy will? The things we're talking about is really ideal. How would the economy really work? It would close the door, it would close the door to profit incentives, it would close the door to new inventions. What is the guarantee that the system would be really efficient like it's in the capitalist system? In the capitalist system, the price system actually controls everything. But how would that be really efficient if the economy is generally flat?
A communist society doesn't necessarily require planning. That would probably be the direction it goes, but you could use the market to facilitate distribution initially. People in capitalism are really used to having this abstract idea called the profit motive dictate what kinds of decisions we think are good. So the new socialist man, at the end of this whole mess, hopefully we'll be able to produce for use instead of exchange. If you look back at the beautiful circuit of circulation, the capitalist way of doing things involves making money at the end. But the simple commodity exchange, where you trade one commodity for another commodity, and you produce things for use, is kind of the direction that we're hoping to get. So it will probably require a lot of transformations in the way that we think about human nature and stuff like that. That doesn't mean it's impossible. A lot of feudalist societies produced for use instead of for exchange. So, it's definitely a major concern, but I think it's overcomable vision for each of that. Yes.
I just had, just a general question on, because I know that we talked about violent revolution a little bit, and I just wanted, a little bit more of your thoughts, because I have, heard definitely that if you, ignore violent revolution, then you sort of ignore the current violence that's going on between class struggle and everything. So I just wanted general thoughts or to speak more about that or anything like that.
I think anything is really possible without necessarily the violence needed, but I think it kind of depends, and usually there's a point where you continue that peaceful change and peaceful protest and so on, and a peaceful revolution, but then there's a point in time where you say that enough is enough, we're not moving fast enough, this isn't getting anywhere, where the government keeps trying to stop us, where you'd have to turn to that violent solution. But you have to keep in mind that a violent revolution, or the idea of a violent revolution, should be the second option or one of your last options. You should try, by all means, to go the peaceful route. The We don't have to kill anyone. I'd rather we not kill anyone. But, you know, that's just me. But I would try the most peaceful route possible. And, you know, there's a point in time where it might turn that you don't have much of an option. If you have someone like Trump who becomes president, which we hope not, but let's say that man becomes president, yeah, I can definitely see a fascist regime where violent protest would be your only option. Violent protest or you're screwed, pretty much. So that's my take on it.
Another thing is the violent revolution should only be used if there are no democratic means of overthrow, if there are no possible ways to change the government inherently. Like, we have democracy, it's a lot easier to change our government. If Trump, for somehow, established a military dictatorship in this country, not saying he will, note, if for some reason an authoritarian government took power in our country, it would be more feasible and more logical to attempt a violent revolution because there would be no democratic tools of change. But as a general rule, you try to reform the society within the bounds of that society without attempting to destroy the oppressive institutions of capitalism by force.
I think you could argue that a lot of people are already disenfranchised and therefore have no other option at that point.
Yes,
And that's like, yeah, it's already happening for some people.
a lot of people would argue that you essentially have no power in the system because many corporations control a lot more power, command, or respect than individual voters as well.
If we were to take up our,
Go ahead.
just real quick, if we were to try to battle the United States military, we're going to lose. The Navy has this thing called a railgun, which is a magnetic cannon, and it can fling this giant hunk of metal like hundreds of miles, and it can hit a target within like this space, and it will blow it up. So I think that if there were to be a violent revolution, the military of the United States should be on the side of the revolution. However, there are smaller kinds of conflicts, like between the police, which I think is what you were referring to, and you know those should be tactfully employed if they are to be, if they need to be, because you know the general, general opinion of whether or not that's good is going to affect the outcome of the revolution. Like the Black Panthers, I think did a good job of using violence.
What I was going to say is, I don't know if this is what you're talking about, but in Central America in the 1980s, some revolutionaries came out of the Catholic just war theory and said that the current situation is so violent and so many people are being killed by poverty, by lack of access to health care and nutrition, not to mention cop shooting black people type of thing, that proportionately, and then you get into these like moralistic arguments that have to do with just war theory, that the revolutionary violence is justified and is much less deadly than the pre-existing violence of unequal society, of capitalism, basically.
Is everybody tired and bored yet?
No.
Any parting thoughts or anything else? All right. Crickets have won. Thank you all for coming. Yeah, like we said, Students for a Democratic Society, we meet 7 o'clock Thursdays, McLean 210. You don't have to be a socialist, in fact, or a communist. We have liberals, we might have a libertarian, we might have an anarchist, but whatever political persuasion. We have more than one anarchist, apparently. Yeah, and what else do we got? We had some college Republicans sign up. I don't know if they're going to join, but open to anybody. We mostly do activism stuff. Political education like this is something that we think is kind of important, but we tend to do more action stuff. So yeah, I hope that you consider joining or doing stuff with us. Thanks.